Jimmy Evans is a cute little 8-year-old kid, a little nixy sometimes, but people call him JR to distinguish him from his father, who is James Dalton Evans Sr. This particular day, he's in the backyard, tossing his ball in the air, catching it when it comes down, tossing it, catching it, and suddenly hears from inside the house this shrill, loud female voice that says, "James Dalton Evans Jr., you get in this house right now." That doesn't sound good. I'm guessing that you've experienced, as I have, the only time that anybody ever uses your whole name is when you're in trouble. Jesus did the very same thing to this apostle, but for a very different reason. I want you to reimagine the scene. They're on the beach. Jesus has made a fire. He's prepared bread and fish, and the 7 apostles who have been out fishing all night and caught nothing, they come in, they bring the fish with them, and Jesus serves them breakfast. But I want you to note something particularly. Back in verse 9, when they had landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. The fire of burning coals is a particular Greek word that is only used one other time in the entire New Testament. It's that scene in John 18 in the courtyard of the high priest, where some soldiers and some officials have built a fire to warm themselves, and Peter is there warming himself by that fire. The term there sounds like a charcoal fire. You know how that charcoal fire smells a little bit different than a wood fire? Jesus has built a fire just like that fire. The night that Peter was warming himself, he smelled that charcoal fire. It was the same night he would deny even knowing Jesus 3 times. Fast forward, we're back on the beach. Jesus has built a charcoal fire. And as Peter is sitting and eating, and he's smelling that charcoal. Smell is one of the most powerful memory triggers of all our senses. And Peter, in smelling that charcoal fire, may be flashing back to the worst night of his life. Why would Jesus do that to him? I think because Jesus wants to deal with this. He doesn't want to sweep this under the rug. Poor Peter, you had a bad night. I understand. It's not a big deal. Just let it go and don't worry about it. Let's get on with life. Jesus never lets something as breaking and painful as what Peter went through just go by the wayside. He wants to deal with this with Peter. And the charcoal is a reminder of that night. Not to remind him of how bad that was, how badly he did, but to deal with it so we can move on. And so when breakfast is done, over in verse 20, this is later in the conversation, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. Apparently, Jesus said to Peter, "Peter, let's take a walk." So while the others are finishing breakfast, Jesus and Peter are walking. What's going through Peter's mind right now? He is so glad that his best friend, his Lord, is alive. But what's going to happen now? And the first thing out of Jesus' mouth in this conversation as they're walking is to use Peter's full name. Simon, son of John. In that culture, this was how you addressed someone as their full name. Simon, son of John. That moment took Peter back even further than the night that he betrayed Jesus, back to the very first time he met Jesus in John chapter 1. Jesus is looking at Peter and says to him, "You are Simon, son of John." There it is, that full name again. And what he's saying to this fisherman is that this is who you've been to this point. You are Simon, son of John. You're a fisherman. This is what your whole life has been. One day, you will be called Peter. Anybody who knew this big fisherman might have chuckled at that possibility. Peter? Peter? Impetuous Peter? Fly off the handle at any moment, Peter? The guy who takes off on something and doesn't finish things? That Peter? You, Jesus, think he's going to be a rock, stable and strong? Jesus is not looking at where Peter has been. He's looking at what Peter will be one day. That's what happened in that initial meeting with Jesus. So now we flash back to the scene on the beach, and they're taking the walk, and Jesus says to Peter, "Simon, son of John," recalling that conversation. Up to that point, you had been a fisherman. And then I called you. And you left the nets and the boats, and you followed me, and you became a catcher of men. You began to bring people to the kingdom. But then you changed your mind and went back to fishing. And then I called you again. Now it's time for another change. But I have a question for you, Peter. There's a lot coming. Someday you're going to have to be a teacher, a primary leader in the church. You're going to have to resolve conflict between believers. You're going to have to administer church discipline. You're going to have to write doctrine. You're going to have to lead the church. But before all that, the one qualification for all those amazing things that has nothing to do with actually doing that, it's not about your gifting. The one thing I need to know from you, Peter, do you love me? Okay, Jesus, what does that have to do with all those things that are going to be going on? Jesus is not asking, do you have warm, fuzzy feelings toward me? Jesus is asking, are you really devoted to me above everything else, Peter? Do you love me more than these? And I don't know what Jesus was pointing at, but I can just imagine more than these men that you've become brothers with. I've often wondered whether the other apostles knew about Peter's denial. Did they know how badly he had messed up? I'm not sure if Scripture ever says whether they knew. They probably found out. But they were still brothers, and Jesus is asking, do you love me more than them? Do you love me more than the fishing boat and the net and that lifestyle and your identity as a fisherman? Do you love me more than that? Am I the most important person in your life? And of course, Peter said, yes, Lord, I am devoted to you. if that's the case, then the thing that's going to happen next that you weren't expecting, demonstrate your love for me. Feed my sheep. I wonder if a puzzled expression might have come over Peter's face. I know fish. I know these men. Jesus. I know one of a sheep from another, but I have no idea how to care for them. Jesus is asking Peter, are you prepared to give up what you're familiar with? Are you prepared to lose all that to follow me? And Peter insisted that he was. Jesus asked the question 3 times, of course, as a counter to the 3 denials on that worst night of Peter's life. I will love you and follow you. The Word tells us that each individual person has value, but to discover a person's meaning in life and why they're on this planet has to be in relationship. You aren't you apart from your relationships, because that's what gives you meaning and purpose. So when you experience a significant loss in your life, someone you love deeply, a spouse, a parent, a child. Adrian Markey mentioned to me that he lost his son a number of years ago, and he's still dealing with that. Maybe the loss of a job, retirement. And you begin to ask, without that made my life so important, who am I? I'll use myself as an example. If anything would happen to Janice, I can no longer say I'm Janice's husband. Now I suddenly enter the ranks of a widower. What's that about? I have no experience with that. Who am I now? The house that you have so many memories and so many things that are important, and the house burns to the ground, all of a sudden that loss gets very personal. Who am I? Even the process of aging can make you feel a loss. I was with Janice's library kids this week, and they did the song Head, Shoulders, Knees, and Toes. Janice was doing the exercising, and I'm sitting with my guitar playing away and thinking to myself, I'm so glad she's doing that and I'm not. We're actually cutting back on one of the flower beds in our yard. Huge flower bed, magnificent. We get compliments from people all the time. We're cutting it back because it's a lot more flower bed than we are able or willing to put ourselves through to maintain. Didn't used to be like that. Aging itself brings that sense of loss. I'm not what I used to be. So since I'm not what I used to be, then who am I now? A number of years ago, a great-grandmother named Minnie had reached her 96th birthday, and a documentary was done about her life. And she had a loving, devoted family. She was able to still live by herself. Her health was reasonable for 96. And they asked, how is your life now? And she said, in spite of all the things that are wonderful still, the thing I miss most is that there's no one anymore who calls me Minnie. I'm Grandma, I'm Mom, but my friends are all gone. Nobody calls me Minnie anymore. When you're experiencing those kinds of loss and not sure who you are at this point, that's the moment that Jesus comes to you and says your full name, not because you're in trouble, but because he knows every part of you, even where you are right now, even in the middle of this loss. He knows you and says to you, do you love me more than you loved that job you just retired from? Do you love me more than that woman, that man that's just died with whom you have spent so many years? Do you love me more than that pet that just died and has left you brokenhearted? Do you love me more than the house that burned? Do you love me more? Because wherever you are at this point in your life, whatever losses have accumulated, Jesus has brought you to this point in your life for a purpose that you probably could not have seen 15 or 20 or 30 years ago. He loves you so much that he doesn't let you sit back and wallow in the loss. He loves you so much because you are still valued and important and vital. But I can't do it anymore. I can't do anything anymore. I can't do what I used to do anymore. And Jesus' question is not whether you still can. His question is, do you love me? And if you can say, Lord, I am committed to you above even the things I've lost, then he says, together, we will do with the remaining years of your life things that you may not appreciate right now. But I'm asking, calling, commanding you, if you love me, you keep doing. Do you love me? Pray with me.